My name is Hiu Newcomb. I was born on May 18th, 1935. I was born in Honolulu.
Okay.
Honolulu. My father, as many of these, I don't know how far back you want to go, both families came to Hawaii in the late 1800s, probably 1880s, as contract workers from China. And my father's family came from the Macau area, the Portuguese colony, and my mother's family came from Chungshan province, Guangdong, and my mother's grandfather was a labor, well, he turned out to be a labor recruiter for the growers in Hawaii. And I don't know if he was a landowner himself, but he was apparently a tall, impressive person and knew a lot of people. And when he was asked to find workers for the fields in the plantations in Hawaii, he would walk from among the villages and try to find young men who would be willing to go away for 2 or 3 years on a contract and then come back to China. And he, on one of his early trips, he brought one of his own children, my grandfather, and of course he didn't put him into the fields, he put him into the house of the plantation manager. And so Akung, my grandfather, had already had this privileged position being a houseboy in a white household. So he learned English, and he learned the ways of Western civilization, the manners and culture and customs. And I'm not sure when he came. He might have been 10 years old, 12 years old or something, early teenage. And was there, I think his father, who must have made frequent trips with the people he brought over, when he noticed that the local girls were looking at his son, he said, "Okay, it's time for you to go home and get married." And they had already picked out my grandmother for him, and she had been raised as if she was going to marry somebody of some importance and of affluence, because her feet were bound, and she was not going to be expected to fend for herself. She would have servants and all that. So he came back to get married to my grandmother, and as the custom would have had it, he would just then return back to Hawaii, leaving her impregnated and, raise the kids. And she said, "Nothing. I'm making this up. This is what I think must have happened." She said, "Nothing doing. I'm not, why should I stay here? I want to be with you." So he said, "But the life is not so easy there." And she said, "Never mind, I'm going." And so when they both came back to Kauai, the plantation manager gave them a house or built them a house or something, and it's not still there, but the location, of course, is still there. It's right, if you went to Hanalei, the road goes down into the valley, crosses an iron bridge, and right where that iron bridge is where the house was built. It was built over the river, straddling the stream. And when I went visiting there, 20 years ago with my mother, she said, "There's the mango tree that was in our yard." And it was this huge, 80, 100-foot tree that's still there. Great. And she tells a lot of wonderful stories growing up in this house. There were 12 children there. And she said when they wanted to get rid of the garbage, they lifted up the floorboard and just dumped it into the stream. And as a result, there were lots of fish around there, so when they wanted to fish, they just lifted up the floorboard and put a string down and caught some fish for dinner. And so her mother raised these 12 children in that house, And she and her husband also baked dim sum and other little pastries and things. And they had on their porch a place where the cowboys who worked in the nearby plantation could come down and have snacks or have lunch or something. So, I mean, already there was this enterprising kind of Chinese, what do they call them? You know, I can't think of the term, where, you know, the people who leave the country and they go off into their next country and they're enterprising and they make their own business and they make their own new life and all that. This is what they were doing. So, my grandparents, those grandparents, raised the children there, and when they were ready for high school, they were taken to Honolulu for further education. They all had public school education in Honolulu. Honolulu Valley is still looks the same as it did 100 years ago. It's still agricultural. It used to be rice plantations and things. I mean, can you believe that they were raising rice in Honolulu and on that island to be shipped? The rice would be shipped to California to feed the workers in California, the Chinese workers. And this was true until California started growing their own rice, and then the bottom fell out of that farm economy there, and that valley now, I think there's a lot of taro growing in there because there's a great upsurgence in interest in poi and taro for the native Hawaiians. My parents were born on two other islands. My father was born in Hilo, on the island of Hawaii. I hope that's right. It might have been Kona. And my mother was born in Honolulu on the island of Kauai. We were teased at family gatherings that we didn't know Chinese. So, you know, the elders could be talking about all kinds of things, making jokes about us, and we wouldn't know anything about it. And we were also ridiculed for not knowing how to use chopsticks. We don't know. We felt a little bit inferior about that, but there were lots of other things to feel inferior about. Right. I mean, going to a white school, you know, a Howley school, you know, I think I always felt kind of inferior. You know, not as pretty, no blonde hair, blue eyes, and knobby knees, and, you know, but it probably wasn't so different the way that lots of kids feel about themselves. And it wasn't just because I was Chinese. But, truth. When we dated, we wouldn't go out with anybody else. I hardly dated at all, but I knew that I shouldn't be going out with people who were not Chinese. And my parents never told me directly, but, you know, they were always talking on the sides about making disparaging remarks about things. It was a real myth, this melting pot business. It was not melting pot, you know. People were really separate. They really had their own prejudices. I wanted to go to a small co-ed school that was not just music, that would have liberal arts, and Oberlin was the perfect fit. It was this music school and a great progressive college. And so in 1952, I got on this big Lurline, this ocean liner. That was the way we traveled. We didn't go by plane, with my foot locker and my stuff, and traveled 5 days across the Pacific, landed in Los Angeles, took all my stuff off, put it on the train, visited. I think I traveled partly by bus, partly by train, not going directly to Oberlin, which is 35 miles southwest of Cleveland, but visiting some of my parents' friends in San Francisco and St. Louis. It was an amazing, wonderful trip for a kid, you know. My parents knew that I was going to be on my own, and the year before, my sister and my mother and her sisters took a road trip across the United States, and we just drove, and I didn't pay much attention. We saw famous sightseeing places and visited friends and things, but it was a great introduction for me, so it wasn't scary for me to travel by myself when it came time for me to go to Oberlin. So I went there, and I started with the conservatory, and I while I was there, Oberlin figured out a combination program for the conservatory and college. So after my third year, I was in this combination program, which would take 5 years. And so I got a degree from a BA from the college and a Bachelor of Music Education from the conservatory. And with a break in between, where there was 1 year between my 4th and 5th year that I lived in Los Angeles on my own, just for a break. And that's as far as I went with my formal education for music. Oh, my poor father. He was devastated when I got married. They didn't even know about Tony. Of course I didn't tell them anything about him during this tempestuous 5 or 6 year relationship. I mean, how did I know where it was going to go? And I had in the back of my mind, and I told my mother this when she was in her 80s, I said, you know, I don't really blame you for this, but I just want to let you know that all my married life with Tony Newcomb, I was thinking about what you always said to me. Don't marry a Holly guy. My father would, he said, don't marry these Hollies. He said, they'll leave you when you start getting old and wrinkled. They'll leave you for a younger woman, prettier younger woman. You can't trust those guys. You know, no, they're not clean. They're just not trustworthy. So here I was falling in love with this cute Caucasian guy whose parents had misgivings about him and his ability to do anything, let alone support a family. His parents were wonderful to me. I mean, I think they were worried about their boy, but and I guess they sort of worried about me, wondering whether I was going to get left in the lurch by this apparently not totally responsible person. But, you know, when you're in love with somebody, you'll go, I mean, I would go anywhere where he would go. I mean, I saw a much more exciting life than I couldn't imagine going back home and marrying some Chinese doctor. I mean, I had my own prejudices. And all the Chinese boys I knew at the time in high school were boring. I was probably boring too. I mean, and ugly, you know, mainly. So I never had any boyfriends when I was in high school that would have been satisfied my parents anyway. So when it came time in '58 for me to go back home, Tony said, I don't think you better go. I don't think you should go. I think we should get married. And what am I going to do? I mean, my poor father, he's 5,000 miles away. I mean, it's much easier to say no to him than to say no to Tony, who was right there, right? So I told him, and I learned years later, my mother said, I've never seen your father cry, but he really cried when he heard that you were not coming home. It was a huge disappointment to him. And I'm sorry about that. But I'm not sorry at all that the choice I made. And when he came to visit a few years later, I told him how much I loved my life and how things were going. And he was, I mean, actually, he got won over as soon as he saw Hannah, of course, my first baby. And we went to visit them when she was born in September. We went to visit, she must have been 8 months old or something. Cute as anything, of course. Soon after that, we moved. We bought a townhouse near DuPont Circle, and we lived there, 60-something, and soon after that, that was when Tony started having fantasies about being a farmer. I had no fantasies about being a farmer. Absolutely not. I was going to be a music teacher, you know. Right. No, Tony was a very interesting person. He grew up just on the other side of the Maymont here, near this subdivision. His parents, his father was a professional economist, his mother was an educator. And Tony got his education at Oberlin as an economist. He was a fiscal economist. And but in high school, he had a tractor that he used. They were living in this area, and he would do custom plowing and disking for people's gardens. He didn't know anything about farming, but he liked using equipment. He was what people would call a shade tree mechanic. He could work on cars and different things. And he had a lot of interest, and that was part of his problem. His parents were worried about him, that he had... My daughter, Hannah, now says if such a thing, diagnosis, existed at that time in the 50s, he would have been said he had ADD. You know, he just couldn't stay on one project long enough to finish anything, and that was his. He just had lots of ideas all the time, and he, in his last year at Oberlin, did a lot of reading about utopias, and he says, "That's what." He says, "We all should be living a better life," and he had visions of. He called it the kingdom on the James. And he wrote a little treatise about it, about James River. And he saw creating an agrarian-based community south of here, and where people would be more self-sufficient, but they could also have jobs off the farm and all that stuff. And so when we moved here in '58 and he started working, he was thinking about all these things, and he was a good analyst. He had a good mind, and but he never finished his thesis for his master's. Typical. And he worked as an analyst for the National Association of Home Builders, and his last job was at the FCTA. What does that stand for? I don't know. It was the agency that designed or did the economic analysis for the metro system. And but all the time he was thinking about how he was going to retire at 29. We married at 24. We were 23 at the time when we got married. So he had 6 years of government service, and he was going to retire at 29, and he in fact did. By that time we were already farming. But he would sit in his office and wish that he could take a nap. And that he could take a nap anytime he wanted to, and it didn't have to hide behind a closed door of his office. So he said, we need to start learning about farming and having a different kind of life where I had more control over my daily routine. We didn't realize 50 years ago that we were at the forefront of a new movement. Absolutely, we were doing this Tony was doing it because he wanted to do it, because he felt that he was going to create a different life. We wanted to create a different society kind of thing. I had no lofty ideals, of that kind of thing. They've developed over time. And I certainly didn't have any thoughts about farming. And this whole organic thing, we've grown up with it. We found out that our aversion to poisons and things was, which is a normal thing to have, is actually a good thing to promote. And then to learning about all this microbial stuff, that's come in the last 15 years or so. And it makes it just is much more, it shores up what we're doing. It gives a science base if you need to have a science base, so it's not just all fluffy stuff, mystical and all that. There's just such good reasons to do what we're doing. And, talk about prejudices people might have had about farmers, being hicks and not, or it's your birthright, so that's all that you can't do anything professional, so this is what you're going to do. My children and my grandchildren have grown up in this kind of place where farmers are king. That we are valuable members of the society, that we do vital essential work. There's no apologies to be made. We would certainly not forego any of the formal education we've had, or we certainly read our newspapers, we certainly participate in the whole community. We're not just narrowly into the farming thing, but it's great to find out that the farming thing can be a huge contribution to the whole idea of sustainability. That we are part of a group that is growing slowly, that cares about how the food is grown and how the choices we've made in the last 50 years for industrial agriculture are turning out not to be good, just like the Green Revolution, which was started with good intentions is turning out to be not so good in the long run. But we don't know these things a lot of the time. You have to sort of tentatively try things, and if you're lucky like we were, we find out we're on the right side. You know, I mean, it's great. And it's a kind of a surprise to be patted on the back for these kind of things because, you know, it just evolved. I mean, it's just happening all the time. And if you're thinking, and if you're in a mindset of wanting to do the right thing and being incongruent with the planet, with the environment, then why would you do something else? You know, we opened the toolbox of the organic methods. Why would you ever go back to the other toolbox? I mean, it's not, I mean, it's more difficult in some ways, but it's more difficult in management than it is in any other way. But, you know, the mind is a wonderful thing that once you get into a different mindset, all kind of other things are possible, and you just turn your eyes away from that other old way. You know, farming is one of the most unnatural things you can do. It's pushing things around, making things, changing nature as it really is, trying to tame it, trying to get something what you want out of a piece of ground, doing away with all the weeds, you know, really narrowing your vision in a way. So, and that hasn't worked, you know, in monocultures and all that. And it's a real struggle. I mean, our big thing is weeds. I mean, so the more we can learn about how to manage these things in an economic way so that it makes money for us as well as not doing harm, that's what we really need to do. Above all, do no harm. Occasionally I have requests to host some Chinese scholars who come, or some Chinese officials who want to see a farm. I mean, what a funny place to bring somebody who wants to see American agriculture. I mean, this is the new face of American agriculture, but it's very atypical. But anyway, I feel very inexplicably drawn to these people. I mean, I feel a kinship with people I can't even speak their language. I mean, they don't really look like me, but there's something there, you know, and I'm reminded. Even my children, you know, they don't see themselves as very Asian. And it's really interesting since I've become involved in, a little bit involved in reevaluation counseling, which is co-counseling. And they have meetings for Asian people. And I said, or people of color, that's the thing, people of color. I've never thought of myself as a person of color. I said, is that my group? I mean, and yet once I decided I would go, I found a kinship with Filipinos, with Koreans, with other people, and there is something there that I've either denied or it's not been in my life, my regular life. I don't feel uncomfortable with them, but I don't seek them out. And I feel like they need me to be a kind of liaison to the rest of society because I feel so comfortable in the place where I live. I have never experienced prejudice or bad behavior, except for the first summer after I came here, came as a student, and I was denied service at a restaurant. I thought that was weird. I mean, I was waiting to be picked up to go to a Girl Scout a camp or something. And since then, I've decided that if anybody treats me poorly, I can look at them and say, what? What are you doing? I mean, what are you thinking about? And the more of the questions I get is, what tribe do you come from? Because I think I'm an American Indian. And I have never had the presence of mind to make a lie out of something like that and give them an interesting story. And I don't say I'm Chinese. I never say I'm Chinese. But then I think it's interesting. And I say, well, my grandparents came from China. And that should give you a clue, you know, about where I'm from. And I don't, and maybe I have no, when I read some of your questions, I thought, oh my God, how am I going to answer this thing? I don't really have a sense of being Chinese. And it's only been through this experience of being identified as a person of color that now I see this, and I've been kind of forced to think about, why have I denied this? You know, am I uncomfortable about it? Do I still feel inferior? I mean, I finally, at 74, I mean, maybe before this, I feel totally comfortable in my skin. I have a wonderful husband who allows me to be whoever I am in a way that Tony Newcomb didn't. I was always more afraid of meeting up. I mean, meeting his expectations as a partner or whatever. But I'm totally comfortable with my life. I love my life. I mean, my only thing now is to try how to gracefully withdraw from the things that have become hard for me to do. And if things become hard for me to do, then I can choose not to do them. There are many other people who can do them. Perfect exit strategy. I mean, I'm really in a good space.